Welcome to Atmospheric Tales, a podcast that amplifies stories and experiences related to air pollution and climate change from around the world. I'm your host Shahzad Ghani, and welcome to the first episode of Atmospheric Tales. Our interviewer for this episode is Tanushree Ganguly. Tanushree is an environmental engineer turned policy researcher. She currently works with the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in India. Our guest today is an expert on modeling and forecasting of air pollution. He is a TED Fellow, a member of the World Health Organization's Air Quality Guidelines Development Group, and the Director of Urban Emissions, which he founded with the vision to be a repository of information, research, and analysis related to air pollution in India. His organization's Air Pollution Knowledge Assessment, or APNA City program, reports on emissions and modeling results from 50 cities in India, each with a population of more than 1 million. In addition to writing scientific papers and policy briefs, he also frequently writes newspaper articles, blog posts, and comic strips to educate a wide range of audience. I am excited to welcome Dr. Sharath Gutikonda. Welcome both.
Thank you, Shahzad. Hi, Sharath. How are you? How are you enjoying the blue skies?
It's going well. I'm actually sitting in a very, very humid environment. But it's good. It's good to have some fresh air, which is not riddled with any pollutants.
You know what? I'm seeing a lot of posts from people all across Delhi and Gurgaon. We've actually witnessed rainbows this evening. Isn't it amazing? So, for our listeners, I've known Sharath for the past 2 years now. Sharath, you are pretty much the uncrowned king of AQ, air quality data analytics in the country. Um, Whatever is our understanding of pollution sources in Indian cities and the extent to which these sources contribute to air pollution largely comes from your research. And I personally recently had the good fortune of working with you while reviewing the clean air plans which were made by Indian cities in response to the National Clean Air Program. To be very honest, I did not anticipate seeing such blue skies so soon. Did you?
No, absolutely not. I mean, that's one of the things that we put in the review as well, saying we really need a coordinated action from all the sectors in all the cities if we really want to achieve such big drops as discussed in the National Clean Air Program. And what we are seeing today is exactly that. But instead of seeing a coordinated action, we have a forced experiment.
Interesting. Forced experiment. This is something that you also referred to in one of New Yorker articles in which you were recently quoted. Would you like to explain why you are referring to this sudden appearance of blue skies as a natural experiment?
Yes, I mean, we had experiments before, but those were more of special instances. For example, in India, we have something called Bandh, which is if a political party or a public group tries to do a protest, you have certain sections of the cities are closed down for all the commercial and the traffic activity. So you will, on an instance like that, you have some kind of drop. And even during national festivals, for example, national holidays, Republic Day or even Diwali, you have a sudden drop in a certain level of activities. But what we are seeing in the past 3 weeks, and this is the fourth week of the lockdown, is basically a coordinated drop in pretty much everything that we can think of. I mean, traffic is down to the bare minimum. All the factories are closed. Some of the cooking activity that would have happened in the construction sector, the labor groups, that's pretty much vanished out of the system. And we have a big drop even in the heavy industry. So for example, the power sector, I think we have a 25% drop in the overall generational load in the country. So all these came out at the same time and as if it was coordinated, and it really basically brought down levels in pollution across the board. And we are seeing that in the cities, we are seeing that in the rural areas. I mean, you might have seen some of these pictures. I think even some of your colleagues were posted earlier. about out of Jalandhar, you could see the Himachal Pradesh, Himachal range, a range of mountains in the Himalayas. You could see them like 200 kilometers away from the spot. And some of the old people were saying that something like that was never seen in like 30 years, 40 years. So which is, on one side, it's really beautiful. But also the only reason why we are seeing that is because of this huge experiment that's going on, like not just in the cities, but across the country. In fact, across the globe.
Right. Sharath, if I may ask you, a lot of young researchers, they keep a track of air quality data, which is basically the data which gets reported by monitoring stations. And on the basis of those data points, they sort of give inferences on how air quality has improved or deteriorated. But when we talk about your setup, it's way more comprehensive than just looking at trends of concentrations of pollutants, right? So, if you could briefly explain to our listeners what your setup is like and what you do, how you do, and how this basically translates into relevant information about polluting sources and pollution in cities, states, across borders.
I think you are being very, very generous. And we do have a comprehensive system, but it's an evolving system. And every day we are learning. I think that's the main part. When we talk about modeling activities, it's not something that you take a database from a site or from a group and put it into a model and you get something out of it. I mean, what we're trying to do is basically replicate or understand what we're seeing in the reality. And the reality is this coming from the monitoring data. So at the end of the day, maybe we want to basically work with the monitoring data, and because that's the ground truthing, and that's what gives us the trends in the air pollution. Each of these air pollutants, whether going up or coming down, where are the hotspots. But it also comes with a tag of high finances. I mean, if you want to run 100 monitors, you have a very high price associated with that. So the only way to bridge that gap is through this modeling activity. But I mean, I'm keeping it very simple, but the modeling itself takes a lot of effort. We need a lot of data, and that is something we're always in the search for. And if you go back even 5 years ago or 6 years ago, even 10 years ago, the kind of data that was available for any of these sectors, I mean, it was really hard to put a coherent story. But now we are able to build that story, and thanks to a lot of digital revolution in that process. So as simple as let's say if you want to find out how congested is a city. I mean, 10 years ago it was very, very difficult, but now groups like Google and a couple of other private companies, I mean, they have access to like cell phone movements across the country, and they can tell you exactly how fast these cell phones are moving, whether a bunch of these cell phones are sitting in a bus or are they sitting in a car or a motorcycle. They can actually separate out all these trends and tell you how congested a city is. I mean, this was not possible to do this 5 years ago. But having that kind of information in hand, we can use that to model the transport sector that much better. I mean, not just for the operations in the city to have a intelligent transport system put in place for the buses or to tell which route to take, which is faster, but we can also use it to understand air pollution. I mean, if you have groups or sections in the city where you're consistently seeing red, which means that you have a lot of congestion, which means you have a lot of wastage of fuel, which means you have a lot of emissions coming from there. And then that translates into pollution, not just for the traffic cop that's sitting there or standing there, but also anybody who's sitting there at the junction. So this kind of information is really vital. And when every day when we are doing modeling, we're looking for resources like these as granular as possible that will eventually help us in putting together a coherent story. So in simple terms, yes, monitoring data is something that's very basic, and we want that in as much detail as possible. But modeling data will take that monitoring data one step further in explaining why a number is high or low, and to find out where which sector or what source could be contributing to that number. So it's a evolving process, and this is something that we are pretty much learning every day.
Thank you, Sharat. That was a very comprehensive and explanatory answer. But it gives rise to fundamental questions. One is, this is something that I would personally want to know. When you envisioned and started urban emissions back in 2007, was this what you wanted to do? Like you rightly pointed out, over the past decade, the world has gone through an information revolution of sorts, right? There is a lot of information that has come in and that has enabled formation of these systems. So how has
Correct.
that sort of a, how did you sort of change your strategy or modify your strategy with the information that sort of came in over the course of years? And the other thing that you just talked about, that eventually we do need to look at numbers, but then what's in a number? For people who have applications on their phone and they are looking at these numbers, how do they find an association with the number? What I want you to explain to our listeners is that what exactly is clean air? Is a number representative of clean air? So those two questions, if you could address.
Yeah. So I mean, you talk about information revolution, but sometimes it's also information overload. In some cases, I mean, we really don't know what to do with some of the information. So it's something that we really have to be very careful about. I mean, we want to tell a story, but I mean, we don't want to burden either the listener or the reader with information that they really don't understand. I think this is where I think your question of like what is clean air really comes in. I mean, we have lots of numbers thrown at us at all the time, uh, both in terms of air quality, emissions, models, all these feeds coming from different sectors on power generation and all these things. So we really need to be careful on this information overload. So to very simple, I mean, if we want to simply explain what is clean air and what kind of number can they represent that. I think that's one of the reasons why we have these air quality index codes, right? So we really want to dump it down and for a general public to say, okay, if it is green, which is good. If it is yellow, moderate. Orange, red, brown, the more deeper the colors, it's basically you're getting into a different kind of territory. So you have to be more careful and adjust your movements accordingly. But I mean, it's one of the biggest questions that we have to grapple with everywhere. And I think, for example, some of the discussions that we are having under the air quality guidelines committee groups are basically defining this. Like, what is air quality? What is clean air? Because every country has their own standards. Every country has their own air quality index codes. And can we have a unified code that will kind of explain what is clean air for across the globe? I mean, that's actually a really big challenge. And we do have to customize to our natural environments. For example, being in India, we know that we live in a very dusty environment. Even if we clean out all our roads, I mean, we have very arid region to our west, and we have enough winds passing throughout the year. We'll have some form of dust events, and we have all these dry plateaus across the country. We'll have dust eventually anyway. We are surrounded by the sea in the peninsula, which means that we have a constant amount of sea salt blowing across. So we have a natural background that will probably not let us get to the WHO guidelines. But I mean, our definition of clean air would be embedded in like our own standards.
Right. I think you've touched upon very interesting points. You've talked about dust being a prominent pollutant in our country. You've touched upon sea salt, but we're still talking about the space of particulate pollution. But there are standards for other pollutants as well, and in one of your more recent articles, you've actually, very beautifully explained how every pollutant says a different story. So if you could touch a little bit upon that, that how is it that every pollution has its own story to tell?
I think by virtue of being in India, we always talk about PM 2.5 particulate matter all the time. But it's also very, very important that we talk about other pollutants as well. And the current experiment that the lockdown has also revealed some of these features. For example, when those are the features that we explained in the article. PM 2.5 definitely with a big drop in almost all the combustion sectors, we see the drop anyway. You look at NOx, nitrogen oxides, you have NO and NO2. Those are that's a dramatic pollutant. I mean, especially in the cities where the monitoring stations are, they recorded a immediate drop in the nitrogen oxides concentrations, because your majority of your source is vehicle exhaust, and with more than 90% of the vehicles out of the system, your NOx emissions have completely out of the city air. So there was a significant drop in that. But you go into other pollutants, other two pollutants which are a little bit dormant, like SO2, sulfur dioxide. We don't see a big change in that, mainly because in the cities, mainly in the big cities, we already have Bharat Standard 6 fuel, which is equivalent to Euro Standard 6 fuel, which has the least amount of sulfur content. I think we have now 15 ppm sulfur diesel in the city. And there is, so even before the lockdown, the sulfur pollution was already to the bare minimum because of this new fuel in the system. So it really didn't make a huge difference in the overall concentrations of SO2. And the other source of SO2 is basically coal burning that's happening at the power plants, mostly surrounding the city areas. And those are working at a lower load, but they were still working. So the drop in the SO2 was not so much. So it's very interesting. So some pollutants like PM 2.5 NO2, it's a very dramatic drop, and then SO2 not so much. And you have carbon monoxide, also a very important pollutant in the atmosphere for the background levels and also for the health. That also didn't change so much, because your biggest contributor is, again, it's actually a big background pollutant, has a very long atmospheric lifetime, about 2 months. So it kind of stayed there for at least a week or so and slowly dropped, but it dropped not as much as the other pollutants. But more important is the ozone. While other pollutants have seen a drop or constant over the last 4 weeks, the ozone is something that's really creeping up. And that's actually, it actually puts a lot of interest on that pollutant. And a theory that was always a theory before, but we could never have a proof for it, is whether Indian cities are the volatile organic compound limited, or they are NOx limited regime for ozone production. And what we are seeing now is a proof that we are really a VOC limited environment, which means that as we are reducing our NOx emissions, ozone levels are actually going up. And I mean, if in a very, very simple terms, without going into the chemistry, if you look at the two components of NOx, the nitrogen oxides, you have NO and you have NO2. NO basically eats ozone, and NO2 actually makes ozone. I mean, in the presence of VOC. So I'm not really going into all the chemistry lessons here. So with the entire NOx out, and there is no NO left to eat the ozone, so slowly the background concentrations have crept up. I mean, in general, ozone levels in our Indian cities are not as bad as we see in EU and US. I mean, we very rarely get into a yellow or a red zone for the ozone pollution. But I mean, what we have seen in the last 4 weeks, it really puts the chemistry, atmospheric chemistry, into perspective. What changes are there in the secondary chemistry for the particulates, and what chemistry is what photochemistry is active in these cities. And it really is, I mean, on one side, I would like to say that it's an exciting time for the atmospheric chemists, but also at the same time, there is nice clean air outside and I can't go out.
That's indeed the irony. But Sarath, before we move to the next question, I would like you to explain what VOCs are and where these VOCs creep into the atmosphere from.
We have VOCs from two different sources. We have anthropogenic sources and also we have natural sources. So anthropogenic sources are any of the solvent activities when you have VOCs coming out. And as simple as when you have a lot of evaporative emissions happening at the petrol bunks, at the petrol stations, the gas stations. So that forms part of your VOCs. Most of the refining activities, they also produce a lot of VOCs that we need to account for. And on the natural emissions, we have basically biogenics. If we have a lot of green area and enough time, if the meteorology helps to, helps in the direction, you have a good amount of isoprene and terpene and monoterpenes. They also come out. I mean, those are a big chunk of the VOCs that we have in the system. So those are natural emissions are fairly constant. I mean, they have a seasonal cycle, but they're there all the time. But what we are seeing is some drop in the VOCs from the anthropogenic side, but the biggest drop is basically coming from the NOx side, which is driving the chemistry, which is tilting the chemistry, ozone chemistry in the cities.
Understood. So I want to just, draw a string from something that you mentioned earlier, that this is a very exciting time for atmospheric chemists, right? This would be a good time to sort of get into your background a little bit. How is your background different from that of an atmospheric chemist? Um, and I mean, what has been sort of your intellectual motivation or inspiration for doing what you are doing right now?
I think for work-wise, why I'm in the atmospheric field, I think it really goes back to my undergraduate days in the late 90s. There were a couple of projects that we did as undergrads. We were looking at what's a good combination of amino acids that will reduce SO2, that will absorb sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide emissions in the refineries. I mean, it was a sponsored project that we had in the chemical engineering department, and we were working on that. And that kind of led to, I mean, it sounded very interesting to work on these air pollutants. And then a bunch of our friends, we applied for PhDs and we started working more and more into that. So some of the components of air pollution modeling, that's something kind of picked up on the job over the years. But the roots themselves they go back to undergrad days. I mean, I wasn't really seeking it, but a good project came out, and that led to the other, and kind of stuck to this. Where the inspirations and all come from, I think in those days, I mean, you have to understand that there was no social media. When there was no Twitter, there was no internet, there was not even a single email. When we were, all of us students, when we were applying for master's and PhD programs, like 10 of us were using one email address of one of the advisors, which means that everybody was reading everybody's emails. So there was no such thing as, I'll go to the internet and read about what everybody is doing. It's basically, discussions with friends and cousins and reading some articles in the newspaper or hanging around in the library, picking up some books and finding out what's going on everywhere. And when that's what led to some subjects to work on a little bit more.
Interesting. So, do you think this whole lockdown and the impact of lockdown on atmosphere can inspire more atmospheric chemists and more atmospheric modelers? What do you think? I mean, in terms of training the new breed of atmospheric scientists, what role is this lockdown going to play?
No, I think it's just a lot of people are already thinking about it. I think the only bottleneck that we are going to face at the end is not having enough monitoring data to study in a lot more detail. But I mean, we have a really good experiment in place. In the modeling world, we do simulate some clean environments, and this is the clean environment. So what's the difference between this 4 weeks and then the same 4 weeks in the previous year? What kind of changes are we seeing? Where are these changes coming from? I think when we have a really series of questions that we can actually answer, not just from an atmospheric chemistry perspective, but also from the policy perspective as well. I mean, if we can drop NOx emissions by 90% by controlling like pretty much all the traffic, so how much of this can we replicate in the future? I mean, we have a case here, and same thing goes with the waste management. Same thing goes with the domestic sector as well. A lot of biomass burning that goes into the cooking sector has suddenly stopped. So it actually has a huge impact on CO and some of the black carbon and organic carbon components. So we have a lot of chemistry questions and policy questions that we need to answer, and there are already some interesting people who are working on this topic, and more will join. I think this is where some of the new people, whoever is doing a PhD right now, I think if they have some topic related to, I want to study what's the impact of policy on air pollution, I think this is a really good experiment. And since this is happening everywhere, not just in India, I mean, it's happening in US, it's happening in Italy, China, India, Africa, not to the same extent in some of the other regions, but I mean, we really have a case to study globally.
You practically answered my next question. I was going to ask that, of course, this setup has led to a lot of research questions, but has also taught a lot of lessons in terms of how countries need to rethink economic activities and activities in general, be it power generation or mobility. So thank you for answering the lessons bit as well. We are almost drawing close to the end of this episode. I have to ask you. You have developed emission estimates for over 50 cities in the country. That's a mammoth task. I mean, as a young researcher who wants to be able to do this, it's very intimidating. So I really need to know, how do you keep yourself going at it?
No, I think for that question, I think I'll thank the digital world for it, because we're always finding something new. When people ask me, okay, how are you doing? So I'm saying I'm learning something new every day, and I think that's what keeps me going. And as far as the emissions itself goes, yes, doing the 50 cities, it really took us 3 years to put that together. But in the process, we learned a lot of different new things, and in how do we work with data, large data, and how do we work with different cities, what kind of information is available, how can I massage some of this information to make it better. So that was really crucial. But it's very important to understand that the modeling activity needs a couple of things. One is you really need to be patient. Modeling activity is something that you can't do it in Excel, and you can't do it in one day. It takes time. You have to be patient. And some of these things are very routine, and you really need to be in it to do some of this routine work. And that's what and it's very interesting, and I'm not complaining at all, and I don't think I'll ever complain doing what I'm doing right now.
Lovely. So patience is the key, and you have to be in it. And you cannot complain about the routine aspect of modeling. Those are the golden words for all the aspiring modelers out there. Final question. Is there any project or an upcoming interesting research base that you are working on and you would want listeners to eventually take a look at whenever it's out?
I think it actually links to your previous question or previous note that you made. And we, by virtue of being in India, we put together this air pollution knowledge assessment. In short, we call it APNA. APNA in Hindi means our city program. and we built databases for these 50 airsheds, which cover about 60 cities. But that's not the end. And in fact, what you and I have worked on in the National Clean Air Program reviews, that actually include 122 cities, which means that we barely only scratched half the surface. We still have a lot more cities to go, and we are trying to kind of fill that gap. And more importantly, we find that similar work, building baselines for cities is the bare minimum you need if you want to jumpstart a policy discussion in any city. And this is something missing not just in India but everywhere. I mean, if you go to any of the African cities, a lot of the Latin American cities, Balkan cities, you see a lot of gaps in these emission inventories and kind of modeling where that is possible. And I think we have enough know-how across the regions. There are a lot of groups working on bits and pieces. And what we're trying to do is basically make this APNA program more global and have more cities come under this umbrella where we kind of start pulling together stories in one single fashion, so that we don't look at these studies as pilot studies, like one-off studies that individual groups do, but coming from one big source of databases and make it a lot more coherent study. So I think we should definitely look forward to launching of this APNA Global soon.
So from India to spreading its wings across the globe, that's what is in store for urban emissions and for Dr. Sharad Gotikunda. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanushree.
With that, I would like to thank our interviewer Tanushree Ganguly and our guest Dr. Sharad Gotikunda for joining us on this episode of Atmospheric Tales. Thanks to all our listeners for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe and share.